everyone, this is Tyler Dallas from the F.W. de Klerk Foundation, and you're listening to the Constitution at Work podcast, the series for people interested in constitutional matters and transformation in South Africa. Today, we are talking about employment equity in South Africa and how it measures up against the Constitution, with Dave Stewart, Chairman of the F.W. de Klerk Foundation, and Michael Bagraim, renowned labour law expert and a member of Parliament's Employment and Labour Committee. Thank you to each of you for joining us. Now, there's been a lot of buzz over the rationality and constitutionality of employment equity measures recently, with the ANC government's latest attempt to push large-scale demographic representativity into the agricultural and private sectors through the draft employment equity regulations and the draft regulations on water use licenses. To bring our audience up to speed, the employment equity regulations stem from amendments to the Employment Equity Act, which now empowers the Minister of Labour to establish sectoral numerical targets to ensure equitable representation of suitably qualified people from designated groups, which include Black people, women, and people with disabilities at all occupational levels in the workforce. The water regulations, published by the Department of Water and Sanitation, set that companies which require a water use license to take or store water must prove between 25 to 75% Black ownership to be granted such license. Michael, what do you make of these regulations? And specifically, are they in line with the legal requirements set by the Constitution and our labour law for affirmative action measures?
Thank you, and thanks for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. Well, just to start off, I didn't agree with the employment equity legislation in the first place. So you're talking to someone who has an inherent bias against the employment equity legislation. It seems like we're harking back to the system of apartheid very strongly. In fact, there is an argument that it becomes harsher than that. And we are looking at what has happened around the world in terms of social engineering. Social engineering has never worked anywhere in the world. You can look at experiments across the world, and you'll see that when people are forced to conduct the experiment of social engineering, it harks back to centuries, but in particular, we'll all remember the Nazis and their social engineering. And this is what is happening right here and right now, in the fact that we've had the employment equity legislation. We've had it for over 2 decades. It hasn't worked. It's been an absolute shambles. Businesses have been spending a lot of money, time, and effort to try and adhere to the engineering that it has been foisted on them. And it hasn't actually changed all that much, the demographics, other than the growth of the business community into actually reflecting a lot of the demographics, basically the regional demographics around the country. Businesses, and I speak to businesses every day, hundreds of businesses over the week, and they're all telling us that they seriously want to reflect the demographics of the country. It's not like a business is saying, no, we don't want to employ Black people, or we don't want to employ colored or Indian people. Businesses are employing people that are competent. They're employing people that can actually fit for purpose. They can then perform. And so the reality is what we're seeing here in South Africa today is that the business community is playing ball. They're moving with it. And we can't say that the previously disadvantaged are the same as what they are today. We can't say that at all. And so the reality is where we are right now, the employment equity legislation has not really worked. What has worked is the buy-in from the business community who want to reflect what we have. So to answer your question in short is no, the amendments now that we're seeing are illegal. They don't fit in with the Labour Relations Act, absolutely not with the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, and certainly not the Constitution. I look forward to the litigation that is imminent with regard to the legislation that we're seeing now.
Thank you, Michael. And to your point about it being a form of social engineering that we're seeing, Dave, I want to look at the foundation submission on the same matter. We pointed out that we believe the regulations, along with the Employment Equity Act and the practice of demographic representativity, constitute one of the most serious threats to our constitutional order since 1994. Why did we say that? Why do you believe this to be true? And what is the origin of demographic representativity?
Well, Tyler, just to agree with Michael, what we have here with the Employment Equity Act is social engineering on a scale that would have made Hendrik Verwoerd gasp with admiration. He was the person who really applied social engineering in the most catastrophic fashion. And here we have a repetition of the problem. And the reality is that the demographics of South Africa have changed entirely. Now, when you have competition for the top 4 categories in the private sector that are governed by the regulations, that's top management, senior management, professionally qualified people, and skilled people, you have a very mixed community. You have the elite group in the society and the middle class. They comprise 26% of the population, and they're entirely mixed. You have, I think, 9 million Black South Africans in this group. You have 4.1 million whites. You have 1.25 million coloreds. You have 750,000 Asians, and you have many Black, colored, and Indian people in this sector who have higher incomes and higher educational qualifications than millions of white people. So if you are competing for a job, why should a already advantaged person have automatic preference over somebody who has fewer advantages? The only way you can possibly do this, if you want to have kind of affirmative action, is to look at the actual circumstances of the people. And the purpose of all of this, we must remember, was to promote equality. That's what Section 9.2 says. But as Michael has pointed out, these actions of affirmative action have done nothing to promote equality in the last 29 years. South Africa is a more unequal country today than it was in 1994. What we should have been doing, and we agree 100% with the need for remedial action, we should have been spending more money, disproportionate resources on providing the bottom strata of the country with decent education, with decent social services and housing. We should have been adopting policies that would have ensured sustained levels of high economic growth so that we would have addressed the dreadful unemployment problem. That is the way you address inequality in our kind of society. What we simply have at the moment with the Employment Equity Act is the people in the first-class salon of the HMS Titanic shifting chairs. It does nothing for the 70% of the population that really need assistance.
Thank you, Dave. Michael, I'm going to go back to you. You said that the current regulations and actually employment equity as it's being enforced in South Africa right now is illegal under our current labor law. I was hoping you could expand on this a bit, specifically touching on the discussions and the debates that are happening centering around these regulations on whether or not they are racial quotas. Why is that distinction so important between a numerical target and a racial quota?
Thank you for the question, Tyler. And it's an important question because obviously at the end of the day, the Constitutional Court has already ruled on the first employment equity legislation before the amendment. And they said that that was fair discrimination. It made me heart sore, but that's the Constitutional Court and that's the final, they have the final say. But you will recall that as currently advised, the employment equity legislation is subject to a whole lot of checks and balances as it currently is. the amendments don't give you those checks and balances. So what happened is, it said that the businesses themselves would set the future of their business. In other words, they would assess what they need, where they're going. They would consult with the staff. In fact, I've been involved in many of those consultation processes with the staff committees, with the trade unions, with my clients. And we've sat down and worked out how can we reflect the demographics of that particular industry in that particular place. So you've got to take into account where your business is, what are you doing, what skills you need, and all that sort of thing is taken into account. These consultations have been peculiar to that specific business. And so it's absolutely vital that that business itself maps its way forward as to how they're going to meet the demographics of the country. And all the businesses that I've dealt with, and literally hundreds, have all said we want to meet the demographics of the country. We want to show that. We need to show that because you need to draw from a pool of people, and there's no good drawing. Let's say you want to draw only from the colored people. That's not going to be good enough. Businesses want to compete worldwide, and so they need to draw from every single South African, and all of them have said that. But the reality is, let's look at reality right now. The unemployment situation in South Africa is almost at 40%. The unemployment with the youth, COSATU is telling us that about 75%. It's a drastic situation. It is the worst in the world at the moment. Couple that to what Dave Stewart had to say, that we need better skills and training and schooling. Well, what's happened? When you look at the world statistics on productivity, we are the second lowest in the world. So you couple unemployment, which is rampant, you couple that with the productivity, which is really bad. I mean, we have an institution called Productivity SA, which has taken us all the way down to the bottom of the ladder. And then you couple that with the fact that people are not getting the training and the schooling. And so how do you, as a business, know where you're going to get your people? So let's say you're running an engineering workshop. It doesn't help to say, well, we're going to have the positive movement towards black engineers when they're not qualified black engineers. It also doesn't help when you bring in, like Eskom did, highly qualified engineers who happen to be black, who happen to have better qualifications than the old white engineers that were eventually pushed out, but they had no skills. They came onto the set and had a look at the works and couldn't actually do the job. So it takes time. All of this takes time. I've been talking to an institution that needs actuaries. You can get a qualified black actuary anywhere you want, but you need someone who actually can perform. So the situation is not as easy as it seems. The other problem is, so we've got the shrinking economy, we've got the shrinking skills, and the other real problem is, and let's get practical about our labor law, you cannot retrench to make way for someone else. That you can't do. That has been deemed to be illegal by the Constitutional Court. You can't override that unless we have a change to the Labor Relations Act and also to the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. So you can't do that. So you've got a workforce that has to be there to do the work, and you can't say, right, well, we've got engineers, we need 7 engineers, that's all we need. They all happen to be white. We're going to have another 4 engineers who will have to push 4 out and bring in 3 black and 1 colored engineer. You can't do that. And when the workforce is not growing, when the economy is not growing, that's going to be completely impossible. So our employment equity plans at the moment are reflecting all those problems. I can spend the next 20 minutes explaining other problems to you in terms of the Labor Relations Act why you can't do it. So what is the Minister, Thulas Nkezi, do in his wisdom? And I say wisdom with tongue in cheek, because what he's done, he's now set quotas, saying, I'm going to run your business for you. I know your business better than you know it, And I know what you need. And I know that you need 30% colored, 40% black, and 10% white. And then when you look at his actual percentages, it doesn't add up to 100% anyway. So maybe he wants us to employ a couple of Martians. Go and look at those figures that he set out. It is horrific. He obviously failed maths himself. And in fact, I wouldn't appoint him as a minister whether he happened to be Indian. I don't really care. He can't. He's not fit for purpose. And this is the man that under the new legislation has got sole responsibility to actually decide what quotas you're going to have. Yes, he's going to consult, but we all know what consultation means with the ANC. What consultation means is, I hear you, I'm not going to listen to you, and I'm going ahead with my initial plan. That's the minister is notorious for that. He does it every single time he is going to consult. And this new piece of legislation, the amendment to the Employment Equity Act, specifically says that he will consult and then he will implement. But the consultation is a sham. He's living in Alice in Wonderland if he thinks that we believe that he's going to actually consult properly. And you can see that was madness, because he opened up the consultation process for 1 month, and I'm sure that he has got no ability to at least even read the input from the F.W. de Klerk Foundation. I don't believe he would. If you asked him, have you read it, have you seen it, he would never have seen it, he would never know. He might have some lowly official having read it and then filed it in file 13. I know you've done wonderful work, and I know you've put a lot of effort into your submissions, but I don't believe anyone's reading it. You're all dressed up and nowhere to go. And so we need the Constitutional Court to step in as soon as possible before it becomes absolutely disastrous. And it will become disastrous if this goes through and the Constitutional Court takes too long. We can't afford the time, because our business community is shrinking. Our employment situation is getting worse. Our educational system at the moment is up the creek. The Department of Education is almost as bad as the Department of Employment and Labor. And that Department of Education has let the business community down completely. So where you're going to find these people who are fit for purpose, who are qualified to do the job, the minister doesn't seem interested. What he's saying is, I'm setting the target. I don't care. You put them in. If your business fails, well, unfortunately, you can go to the court. Now, you can imagine a business of 100 people, can they afford to go to the labor court and litigate? In the meantime, the minister is sitting with his thumbs twiddling, saying, appoint them in the meantime, because your court case is going to take 2 years before you get to the court. So my strong feeling is this is shambolic, and it's destructive, and it's leading us down the garden path. The whole business community can die when it sees this. Only one glimmer of hope, and I must mention it, is that the fact that the minister, through his advisors, has said, I'm going to exempt businesses under 50 employees. Why does he do that? Because he knows full well that the legislation is destructive. He knows, he wouldn't say, I'm going to exempt people under 50. Why would he do that? Because he knows it's destructive, and he doesn't want to destroy the small businesses that might be able to be the engine room, the cauldron for job creation in the future. But this is an admission that the legislation itself is destructive to business by saying, all right, I'll exempt small business under 50 employee. Otherwise, why would he do it? So it's an admission from government side that we know we're going to add a handbrake to job creation. That's it.
Thank you, Michael. And you've definitely given us a lot to think about. Not only the stats that you mentioned of 40% unemployment, with a youth unemployment of nearly 75%, and being the second lowest productivity country, according to those stats that you spoke to. But I did want to turn back to the point that you made about the state wanting to dictate to business without having any idea of how business works. Now, Dave, we've seen demographic representativity being rolled out mass scale into the public sector with no consideration for how this would impact the productivity of the sector. How do we see businesses being forced to comply with these regulations? I know Michael has said it won't lead to specific firing or retrenching of employees who don't meet the racial quotas, but how else would business have to grapple with these regulations, and what implications could it have for the private sector?
Well, Tyler, we've all seen the effect and impact of demographic representativity in the public sector. It's perhaps one of the main reasons why we have such dysfunctionality in state departments, in municipalities, and in our SOEs. It's not a question of race, it's a question of the need for any organization to appoint people in key jobs on the basis of merit and experience. That is as simple as that. Now, you can do that in the public sector because you can't go bankrupt. The Department of Home Affairs isn't going to go bankrupt if it doesn't meet its objectives. Neither will South African Airways, they'll be bailed out. Neither will Eskom. But if you're a private sector company and you do not make a profit, you go bankrupt. And one of the key points in any business is appointing the right people at the right places. If you can't do that, you're not going to succeed as a business. And that is an absolute requirement for any successful business anywhere. So that is why this will be so destructive to private sector companies. But apart from that, it is, and why we as a foundation opposed it, it is because it is fundamentally unjust and fundamentally irreconcilable with the foundational values in the Constitution that we agreed to in 1996. It is based on racialism. It is the re-racialization of our society. And once you kick away racialism, you kick away human dignity, you kick away equality before the law, and you kick away a whole lot of fundamental rights. So this is profoundly irreconcilable with our Constitution. And if we were to implement the regulations as stipulated by the minister, it would mean that within 5 years, something like 60 or 70% of all of the white people who are in top management jobs, in senior management jobs, in professional jobs or skill jobs would just simply have to go. Where would they go? The government has no conception. It means also that it would be disastrous for other minorities, particularly the colored minority in the Western Cape, because in terms of the regulations, if you are a company that has a national profile, like our big retail chains, Woolworths, Pick n Pay, ShopRite and what have you, or a big bank, Standard Bank, Absa Bank, or any of these big companies with a national profile, you have to apply national demographics, even in a province like the Western Cape. And that means that the great majority of colored people working in these industries in the Western Cape would lose their jobs in the next 5 years. The same would be true of Indians working in KZN. Now, this is fundamentally unjust, fundamentally unworkable. And that is why we are so strongly opposed to this legislation. And that is why we think that it is one of the greatest challenges to our constitutional order since 1996.
Thank you, Dave. Michael, I'm going to ask you to chime in on what Dave has just said to us, specifically in light of that Dis-Chem debacle we saw last year, where there was a moratorium, the hiring of white people. Do you believe that these regulations, if interpreted and implemented by the public, could lead to similar Dis-Chem issues?
Well, absolutely. Dis-Chem was forced into a letter of that nature Obviously, it wasn't supposed to go public, which was a bit sad, but it was a mistake. Someone's thumb slipped and sent it off to the public. But it was good that it did, because it showed us how pernicious the legislation is. Just to quickly look at what, and I'll come back to that now, but what Dave said, if you look at Section 195 of the Constitution, it specifically says that the public administration must be broadly representative of South African people. That's what it says, 1951 in Roman numerals 1. Now, if that's the case, and they've had 30 years to do it since that Constitution, why aren't they? Have a look at the numbers of disabled people in South Africa. The minister's telling us the disability community represents 7 to 8% of the country. The working disability community within the public administration is 0.5%. Why have they not adhered to the Constitution? The private sector are being pushed in this when government itself can't do it. They're telling us, when we ask the minister, he's telling us, well, it's very difficult to find people from the disabled community to fill posts because of their skills and because of their education and training. Well, hello, that's exactly what's going to happen with the entire business community. So when you put a moratorium on the employment of white people at Dis-Chem, what you're doing is you're breaking literally a dozen different types of laws. And what you're also doing is that you're saying to the white population of South Africa, we don't want you. We don't want you here. We don't want you as customers, and we certainly don't want you as employees, and we put a moratorium. Now, again, to answer Dave on this, as a labor lawyer, I am getting dozens of queries from Indian people, colored people, all the time, saying, is my job at risk? Should I be looking elsewhere? Should I be taking my skills to other jurisdictions? So to answer you, Dave, on this, is that the white managerial class, the colored managerial class, those that have got the skills and the training and the background, are all looking beyond South Africa because they feel that they're under enormous threat. Can you imagine what that flight of skills from South Africa, what it'll do to the economy? And by just putting out those regulations, the minister has told South Africans, you should be going, you should be looking elsewhere. And we have this flight of people, all highly qualified, all taxpayers, saying we need to look elsewhere. It's horrific to think that way, but that's unfortunately the way, and especially the youth. They're saying, I come out of university, I've been there for 3, 5, 7 years. I've had 10 years worth of experience in my current job. I'm obviously not going to get promoted because I'm white or I'm colored or I'm Indian. And so I must look elsewhere. And people are uprooting their families and doing it. Now we're even seeing it internally. People are saying in KwaZulu-Natal, if I'm Indian, I'm going to have to uproot my family and take them down to the Cape because there are fewer Indians there and I've got a better chance of finding a job. Now, how ridiculous is that? It's almost like the stupid Americans who are moving people to meet demographics in schools, and they had to move from one area to the next to get into a school. We're doing the same thing. We're uprooting people in each province and moving them around. Can you imagine? We'll do well out of this as the hauliers taking furniture from one province to another. And who will do well out of this is every other country in the world will receive our skilled people, our expensively trained people. They will receive them. And this is the inheritance we're going to get from an ANC government, unfortunately. So the Dis-Chem letter is just 1 in a million. Those letters are going around all across the board. Another thing is that a lot of my clients, and I talk about retail chains across the country, are telling me they can't match it. They know now up front they cannot match those figures. They also know that if they get a 10% fine of their turnover, 10% of turnover fine, that they may as well close their doors and open elsewhere. So the big chains are all looking very carefully. They're not going to go public about it, but they're all looking very carefully about their own future. And should they be rather trading elsewhere? Most of the people in manufacturing are saying, We must open the doors of importing rather, because manufacturing is going to be too difficult. Manufacturing means that you need highly skilled people to use the highly evolved machinery. We're not going to get them in the demographics that we want, so let's rather import from China. The whole exercise, if you look at it as a whole, is destructive to our economy.
Thank you, Michael. Very grim prospects indeed. I just want to turn also to the water use regulations, because I don't think we've really spoken about them much. So, Dave, alongside the water use regulations, where we said we are looking at regulations that impose 25 to 75% Black ownership on companies who need to take water or need to use water in order to get their licenses, they have to comply with these percentages. Looking at this alongside the expropriation bill, it seems the agricultural sector could be severely impacted. In fact, AgriSA has said that the regulations could have a devastating impact on the sector's ability to provide the country with a secure food supply. Michael has just listed the impact it's going to have on business, that it could cripple the economy, it could drive off any investment or wealth into the country. We're now going to be dealing with a food security crisis on the other side. How do we make sense of this? What are your thoughts?
Well, Tyler, I think we must look at the common denominator for both of these problems. In fact, for many of the problems that confront South Africa now, and that is the ANC's policy of radical economic transformation. What they mean by that is the redistribution of wealth and jobs, everything on the basis of demographic representativity. So you'll see that with the water rights, it's also based on demographic representativity. 75% Black people, 25%. Now, this is entirely destructive of the minorities in South Africa. As Michael pointed out, the only conclusion that minorities can come to when confronted with this kind of legislation from their own government is that they are not wanted in South Africa, that they have no future in South Africa, and therefore they should emigrate. Now, the problem with this is that, of course, the more they emigrate, the smaller the percentage of their population group in the demography of South Africa. So you might have been entitled to 8% of the jobs now, if you're a white South African, but in 10 years, sorry, it's only 5%. And the other 3% would have to go. And so it ratchets down to the point where minorities are almost eliminated in South Africa. As F.W. de Klerk said in one of his last speeches, demographic representativity, in terms of demographic representativity, it is a mathematical certainty that minorities will be reduced almost to meaningless proportions of the population, ultimately. This is the underlying threat posed by the regulations under the Employment Equity Act and these water regulations. It is a fundamental denial of all of the things that we agreed to in the 1996 Constitution. And it's for that reason that we have to oppose it. And it's not only a question of the future of minorities, it is a question of the future of everybody in South Africa. We have no doubt that if we really want to promote an economy that is representative of all South Africans, all you have to do is get out of the way. Let companies produce jobs. They will very quickly begin to reflect the demography of the country without any legislation. They will produce wealth and they'll produce opportunities for everybody. But unfortunately, the kind of state intervention, the racial state intervention that we have now, will destroy any prospects of the future well-being of all South Africans, Black South Africans, white South Africans, colored South Africans, and Indian South Africans.
So the Minister of Employment and Labour has defended these measures, saying that these are the laws that are aimed to correct all that was wrong in our terrible and horrible past before our democratic breakthrough. He then goes on to state that our constitution instructs us to redress the imbalances of the past, and alarmingly, that the department is busy looking at some gaps that they believe exist in labour law. Michael, can you give us some insight on this? What type of measures do they believe will correct these historic wrongs? Do we see it leading to an erosion of minority communities, as Dave has said? And what gaps has the department or has Parliament highlighted that need to be filled in labour law?
It's a strange situation that we're seeing from the minister. You will recall in the last State of the Nation address by our president, he's promised the country that they will look at legislation which is standing in the way of job creation. So the president is saying one thing on the one hand, but unfortunately, the Communist Minister of Employment and Labour is saying something exactly opposite. So he's saying, I want to look at the laws and make them harsh so that I can handcuff the business community and I can create more power for government. What the president is saying is that we should be looking at possibly deregulating. That's what he's saying. We remember that our Minister of Finance beforehand, Tita Mboweni, specifically said in one of his addresses that we need to deregulate small business completely. And we need to uncouple them from big business because the regulations are retarding business growth. So we've got people sitting on different sides of the divide saying different things. Now, I don't believe any of them, quite frankly. I think it's the whole thing, the whole debate is duplicitous and it's all politically motivated. I don't see the minister being able to look at changing legislation. Changing legislation of this nature takes 3-4 years. Well, the minister seems to think that the ANC will be in power until God knows when. That's not going to happen. It's definitely not. They don't have the luxury of time. Yes, the stealing will happen big time now for the next year because they have that opportunity to steal. But you don't have an opportunity to change legislation. It's not going to happen. Yes, this legislation was pushed through quickly, but the president, hopefully thinking a little bit at last, has not actually implemented it. It's not been gazetted. So it's not functional at the moment. Even though the window has closed for commentary, and even though the amendment is, it's not functional because the president has not signed it off. And I'm hoping that somewhere his God fairy has said to him, you're going to destroy business altogether, then there'll be nothing to steal. And if that's the case, we don't think we're going to see any amendments coming through anyway. And effectively, Parliament is now in recess. We're in recess for the next 3 or 4 months. Then we go into electioneering. There's going to be little time for any debate or amendments or anything of that nature. So let's not worry about that. Let's focus on legislation that has actually been passed. And I think that the Minister of Employment and Labour has fallen down that hole that Alice fell down. And he's busy having a look at cookies on the shelf. And he's hoping to grab as many as possible. It's all fantasy. And let's leave it at fantasy for the minister. I can't see any other changes being made until the new coalition government comes into being.
Well, it's reassuring to know we can hold off on being too alarmed about labour law changes for now. But looking at these regulations, looking at what we have in front of us right now, how should we be balancing this inequality that the minister and the ANC government pinpoints in employment with the progress and growth of the nation? Dave, you specifically said that you feel that when the ANC government first came to power, they should have prioritized more funding towards education, towards skills development. Well, should have doesn't help us now. We didn't do that. So what can be done now to try and rectify this inequality?
Well, Tyler, the problem with education hasn't been a lack of funding. It's been a lack of management and a lack of appointment of people who are properly qualified in the right jobs. So the fact that we haven't made progress in this really important area is the direct consequence of the employment of people because they're loyal members of the ANC, carded employment, or because of their race. So one of the first things that we must do is to follow recommendations in the National Development Plan and other recommendations that have been made by high-level panels and what have you, that we should appoint people everywhere on the basis of merit. That is the key to the beginning of moving in the right direction. It's not a question of finance. We've got the money. The other point which I would just like to make at this stage is that we shouldn't be too despondent. The great thing about South Africa is that we are still a functioning constitutional democracy. And all of us must now use all of the powers that we enjoy in terms of the Constitution to oppose actions and policies that are so destructive. We have to use our right to freedom of expression. We've got to use our right to access to the courts. We've got to use our right to political mobilization, to protest, to demonstrate against actions that are fundamentally irreconcilable with the constitutional values which we all accepted in 1996. So we should be saying to South Africans across the board, this is unacceptable, do not accept it. Use the rights you have in terms of the Constitution to oppose it and to stop it.
Thank you, Dave. Michael, I'm going to turn to you for your last comments. I also want to know, just in terms of the Constitutional Court stepping in to obviously set aside these regulations, how should big business be stepping in as well?
Well, big business are saying that they're not going to follow the regulations. They've already said that openly. So Dave Stewart is absolutely correct. Big business is standing up, like they did at the time of apartheid when they said, look, we've had enough. We want to have change. Here they've got to do it much more forcefully. We need the business community to stand firm and say we're not going to do it. The banks, I think 2 of the biggest banks in the country have said we don't accept these regulations. The various retail sector businesses, big businesses, I've seen 3 of their submissions. They've all said they cannot do it. We won't do it, and it's going to be destructive to the entire business. So at least they're speaking up. What Dave Stewart is saying is that the man in the street, man and woman in the street, must also take that. And the reality is that we do have a problem in South Africa, in that South Africans up until now have been silent, and we do need them to speak. And the only way we're going to do it is that they'll have an opportunity, probably by about June next year, to go to the polls. That's the one thing they can do, and it's not a big push for them. They go to the polls and vote by showing their disdain for an ANC government that's trying to do this to everyone. So to sum up, I think we can do a lot. I think we can put in our objections. Yes, there are going to be marches. And yes, there are. I know that there are 2 submissions to the Constitutional Court. One's from Solidarity, and the other one, which I've just been through, is from the Democratic Alliance. And it's a solid, absolutely solid argument that they're putting forward. And it's an argument that's saying, let's save South Africa. Let's save the business community, and let's get out there and create jobs. Let's repair the skills deficit that we have. And Dave is absolutely correct. Now what's come out is a lot of the whistleblowers are saying that people buy jobs in the education sector. They don't come in with skills, they come in with money to buy jobs. We're seeing that from the trade unions active in the educational system. They are selling jobs to colleagues. And the problem that we've got there is that the whole educational system is now on its knees. And if you're going to have that, it doesn't matter how much social engineering you want. You're going to have incompetent people, not because of their own fault, but because of government's fault. I blame government. I don't blame people wanting to go and buy their job specifically because they're so desperate. But this is what government's done to the people of South Africa. So there is a future. That future is rosy. We just need people to stand together and hold hands.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Dave, for your time. Thanks to our audience for joining us for this episode of The Constitution at Work. Remember to like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications to be alerted when our next video is up. If you have feedback on today's episode, please feel free to have your say in the comment section. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter at FW de Klerk Foundation to keep up with our latest news. We look forward to checking in again soon.